So here we are with Gento Steve Krieger, who was Steve and I were classmates and roommates actually in college, and so taking various paths to end up where we are today, but still in the same field and conversing with religion and trying to understand its implication and how it impacts life. So. Get to Steve, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are, and then we'll kind of jump into some of the questions the students asked.
Yeah, I mean, so I was living in Los Angeles, working in Hollywood, and I started reading Joseph Campbell, who's a sort of a famous mythologist, and everybody in Hollywood reads Joseph Campbell because he talks about how to tell stories. So I found Buddhism through him, and this was back in the very early days of Google. I Googled Buddhism and I found a group and I sat with them for a while, and I just kind of nosed my way towards Zen after a few years. And I met a really, really interesting monk. He was he was running his sitting group out of a community room in the Tower Records parking garage on Hollywood Boulevard. Really interesting guy. I mean, this room was inhabited at night by homeless people, and it had kind of a really funky feel to it. There were oftentimes drugs on the ground and the weed roaches stamped out in the floor, but he made the space really come alive with just like a vase with a flower in it and his meditation cushion. So he was the real deal. He had studied with my teacher, who was a Zen Buddhist master from Japan. He had studied with him for about 15 years when I met him, and we just became really good friends. And one day I was kind of considering going to a retreat, and so I went to the office at his Zen center, and they said they had room in the retreat, and like just within the next 5 minutes, I had the next 13 years of my life planned out. At the time, I only thought it would be 3 years. My plan was, okay, I'm going to give my mentor my rent-controlled apartment because he was going to move out of the Zen center. And I'm going to go up to the monastery. I'm going to stay there for 3 years, then come back. But it wound up being 13 years.
Wow. And so what was it in particular that drew you to Buddhism? And so just by way of reference, in my other class, we have the students read Joseph Campbell. We actually watched just a little bit of Joseph Campbell with his the 6-hour documentary with Bill Moyers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we talked about sort of like like one of the things in stories what they try to do is try to like you have this duality, good and evil, light and dark. But what was it specifically about Buddhism, especially coming out of and I think I mentioned to the students, it's like coming out of a Catholic upbringing, and you and I going to a relatively conservative Catholic undergraduate institution. So yeah. What was it about Buddhism that drew you in, and like the puzzles that you and I talked offline a little bit about these different mindsets, the Western mindset and the Eastern mindset. So right. Can you talk a little bit of like what drew you in, and like how do you cross that chasm?
Yeah. So I'll jump right into Zen. I don't even really remember how it was just, like I said, I was following my nose with Buddhism. But I remember there was one point, my mentor he's got a wild mind. And so for a while he was working on this book where he was linking aspects of quantum physics to Zen theory, right? So I was off on this adventure with him. He has all these adventures. So I was off on this adventure with him, and I was researching quantum physics, and I'm getting the Zen Buddhism from my mentor, and I'm getting the quantum physics from the books, and I'm reading these books, and I'm reading these books, and I'm reading these books about the science. And at one point, it occurred to me, it was kind of a light went off. It wasn't that I didn't, of course I didn't understand the quantum physics, but I actually realized I have no idea what my mentor is talking about when it comes to Zen Buddhism. And I realized it does not matter how much I study this, how much I read about it, how many sutras I inhale. Something needs to radically shift in my being so that I can actually receive these teachings. So the the big shift for me was realizing that I had to actually do something. I had to practice something. And it's not the same thing as participating in like Catholic rituals for me. It was a kind of investigation of self and consciousness and putting myself in the meditation cushion. I mean, your students asked some really interesting questions. And I found myself thinking at one point, it's a bit like they're asking me, like, what does music smell like? Like, I felt like I'm a violinist and I play the violin, and people were asking me, what does the violin smell like? What's the texture of music? Is it silky or is it rough? Like, the perspective is completely and totally different, especially in Zen. And that's really, we have a limited amount of time, so I won't even get into the other traditions of Buddhism. But Zen Buddhism is really a tradition that's not about theorizing or anything intellectual. It's about I mean, the basic practice is that the idea is you don't know what's going on in your head. Okay, you've got all kinds of things that you're taking for granted, all kinds of things you're trying to prove to yourself and disprove. Your mind is always active, right? So the Zen practice is to sit on the cushion. Okay, you arrange your body in a certain way. So the form in meditation is very clear. You sit with your spine upright, your legs crossed if you can, your hands in a certain mudra, and then what, right? You bring your attention to your breath. Okay, so and all these thoughts are going to come up. So sitting is it's extremely difficult. I mean, if anybody in your class has tried it, just sitting and meditating is profoundly difficult, and your mind is going to explode with what did my mom do to me when I was 10? I need to not be doing this. I'm wasting my time. My back hurts. Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right, and am I wasting my time? Are the thoughts that you have at first, right? So when you're in a Zen meditation retreat, which are the retreats that I did for, we would do one pretty much every 6 weeks. They're week-long retreats, doing for 13 years. So Rinzai Zen, which Samurai Zen, which is the kind of Zen that I did, is really strict. I mean, you're up at 3 a.m, you're in bed at 10 at night during these retreats, and every minute, except for you have about 40 minutes total during the day for break, is spent in some form of meditation, right?
Wow,
so the practice, it's incredibly intense. Arguably insanely intense. I mean, it's designed to train young Japanese monks. It's almost like hazing. It's designed to train these young Japanese monks to take over their dad's temple. And so they get the crap beat out of them for, 4 years, and then they take over the dad's temple. So anyways, my teacher, who was from Kyoto, Japan, brought that practice here. So what happens is all this stuff comes up, right? All these thoughts, all these emotions, you're tortured and you're in bliss, right? And it happens over and over and over. And the practice is so strict because it's keeping you in that state of just, and eventually you get worn out. You just can't listen to your mind anymore, right? So one of the first things you learn is, I don't have to believe everything my mind tells me, right? I mean, it's telling me all kinds of things, but I'm not acting on any of those things. And I can't move on this meditation cushion. So how long am I going to sit here and listen to my head, So eventually what the practice is teaching you is you bring your attention to the breath, right? Mm-hmm. And in Zen Buddhism, it's a very, there's mindfulness, which is in the Theravadan tradition. Right. There's different forms of meditation. In the Zen tradition, you're bringing your attention to your breath and you're giving yourself to the breath completely, right? You're dissolving that thinking mind through an activity. So this is why this comes back to what I said earlier. It's not an intellectual discipline. You're not going to get it through thinking, ever. I mean, my mentor used to say, if you're thinking, you're wrong, right? Yeah. I mean, not wrong, not right, but essentially you treat your thoughts like you would treat clouds in the sky. They kind of come and they kind of go. The thoughts arise and you don't try and push them down and you don't indulge in them. You let them arise and you let them go, and you bring your attention back to your breath. So eventually, if you're able to, so the word Zen comes from the word Chan, which comes from the word jhana, which is a Sanskrit word, which means single-pointed concentration. So you bring your attention, you bring your focus to a certain point, which is your breath. Then that thinking mind dissolves into the breath, right? And there's a point where you're not thinking, okay?
Yeah.
And that's key. Eventually, the self arises again. But usually, if you've done your meditation right, when the self arises again, you feel good. You feel reborn. That's how my teacher used to talk about it, right? And then you can take that activity and you can bring it to any activity in your life. Okay, so you're washing the dishes. Instead of thinking and perseverating, you do the activity completely. That's pretty much Zen in a nutshell. You do the activity completely. You know, we call it in the moment in common parlance, but essentially you're doing the activity completely. Your thinking mind dissolves into the activity. It's like when you do anything you love, you know, when you're hugging your child, you're playing with your child, you're not thinking. If you're thinking, you're not there with your child. You're making complete relationship with the child. And that's essentially what I did for 13 years at a monastery, some version of that practice or another.
Wow. That's a really good analogy, I think, because there are moments in our lives where it's like we are completely engulfed in the moment itself, like I mean, it could be sadness, it could be elation, it could be a wide variety of emotions where you're not passively reflecting on what you're doing at the time. So that's really interesting. I think one of the things that the students have the most trouble with is trying to get past this notion of the autonomous self, and the I and the ego, and really embracing the not self, and just trying to. And we talked in class, about trying, of understanding, went through, and the students kind of listed all sort of like how they define themselves, all their characteristics.
Right.
And it's like, okay, at this moment in time, okay, yes, all these sort of characteristics come together to form what, when you're ordering a coffee at Starbucks, to say, I would like this, but the I is not sort of like this existential existing Western notion of the ego and the self. So how, is that something that like in Zen practice that you try to wrestle with on a daily basis, or is that something that I guess, like, how does that play out? So like it's in meditation, it's one thing, but then sort of like, when you're going through and and doing the dishes, someone is doing the dishes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. That's basically that's the main question. I mean, there's and that's a big one. So there's the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, right? The first noble truth is there is suffering, right? So instead of asking questions about what happens after I die, is there a God? The Buddhist point of view is, look, the problem is suffering. There's this great quote where this guy asked a Zen master, what happens after I die? And the Zen master says, why are you asking me? And the guy says, well, you're a Zen master. And the Zen master says, yeah, but I'm not a dead Zen master. It's not that the question is irrelevant or wrong, but it's not the focus of Zen practice. The focus is, okay, there's suffering. How do we deal with suffering? There's suffering in this world. It's called dukkha. It's a Sanskrit word. It means suffering, or roughly translated as suffering, which isn't quite right. It more means unsatisfactoriness, because sometimes we can have great joy in our lives. We can have the best life ever, but somewhere on this planet there's an immense amount of suffering. And the Buddhist point of view is we need to pay attention to that. So that's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering is essentially attachment. And what we're attached to is our notions of thingness or self. We're attached to ourselves. We're attached to our ideas that things should be a certain way. So fundamental, like you said, to the teaching of Buddhism is the teaching that there is not a self in the way we are conditioned to think of ourselves, and in the way that we sort of reflexively think of ourselves. We tend to think that we're here, there's an existing I am that extends throughout time from one moment to the next and has solid, adamantine reality. And the Buddhist point of view is really like, and this is the sort of thing you have to investigate on the cushion. When you sit for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 5 years, if you do this practice, you start to realize, you start to have some insight into the idea of self, into the experience of self, how the self arises from causes and conditions, and it dissolves and arises again from causes and conditions and dissolves. There's somebody mentioned, I think, codependent origination. Engi, or pratitya samutsampati, is the Buddhist notion of codependent origination. So, I mean, to put it really simply, if this, then that. Okay, so without this, there's no that. Without me, there's no you, right? Everything exists in relation to everything else. Things arise at the same time. They dissolve at the same time. So, I mean, the way my mentor used to talk about it, first of all, there's what's called the skandhas in Buddhism, the 5 skandhas. So you're asking, first of all, there is a self. When I'm sitting there doing the dishes, something is there doing the dishes, right?
Yeah.
But there's not a self. Buddhism asks, Zen asks, question how solid that self is. That's the key to beginning to solve problems of suffering, which is to say problems of selfishness, of evil, all the problems at the heart of the human condition. So there's something called the 5 skandhas, where the Buddhist teachers talk about the self. So there's form or matter, which could be like our body. There's perceptions, there's sensations, there's mental formations, and there's consciousness. Those are the 5 skandhas. Mm-hmm. Those interact with each other, and in some way that we don't understand, and neurology doesn't even understand. Modern neurology doesn't even really. Nobody really understands how the human mind works or how the self arises. But in Buddhist tradition, those 5 factors come together. Skandhas is a Sanskrit word that means heap. This heap of 5 things come together and somehow give rise to a self. And from the Buddhist point of view, that self is always shifting, always changing. It's impermanent, and yeah. It's a bit, the way I think about it is it's a bit like we think we're like a rock, but in fact we're more like a ripple on a wave in the ocean of being. Okay, and it can be really unsettling at first to think I don't exist, but it's actually quite beautiful because it means you're in complete relationship with your surroundings and you're not separate from your surroundings. So bringing it back to meditation, this isn't just some sort of new agey type trick, like you focus on your breath and your self dissolves and then it arises again. What happens is you're breaking down kind of this wall of thinking that separates you from the world around you, and you experience a kind of peace and a kind of connection where there's an awareness or the experience of yourself and the world around you, but not that separation between self and other. Okay?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And not easily accomplished.
No.
No. Okay.
But yeah.
So we've been through first noble truth. Okay. Dukkha. Second noble truth. Talking about the craving.
Cause of suffering.
Yeah, craving or attachment. Attachment. Yeah. Okay. So third noble truth.
Yeah. Third noble truth is so the Buddha lays it out. The historical Buddha figure, who's some guy who was a sage, it was not in any sense sort of revered or worshipped like a Christian Jesus or a Muhammad or anything. He's just basically a great sage. Yeah. He laid it out like a doctor. He diagnosed the problem as suffer. He diagnosed the problem, which is suffering. Then he said the cause of the problem, which is, like you said, craving. I mean, craving is, my teacher unpacked it a bit of a different way. It's attachment. I mean,
Hmm.
we're all gonna crave. We crave for things to be different. We crave more. We crave to satisfy a self that doesn't fundamentally exist um, in the way we think it does. So that's the second noble truth. The third noble truth is the doctor says, "Hold on, don't kill yourself. There's a cure. Okay, there's a cure for suffering." And then the fourth and final noble truth is the eightfold path, which lays out the cure,
Yeah.
which people can Google that because I can't remember it. But that's eight.
Yeah. No,
It's right
since you
meditation.
know,
Yeah,
yeah, they're covering it. But yeah, right action, right
yeah.
speech, right,
But
right
I don't
attention.
think all those things are important. From the Zen perspective, none of that is important. The most important thing is to sit on a cushion and for 5 minutes or sit on a chair, just sit in silence. And you can get to know yourself. You can watch your mind instead of compulsively following the dictates that this organ called the brain puts upon you. You can take a step back. This is called mindfulness or Theravada practice. You can note when your thoughts arise, and you don't have to follow them. You don't have to listen to them. You don't have to believe them. And the practice is always bring your attention to your breath because you're dissolving that wall of thinking and connecting to the world around you. And answers arise from that. Answers about, is there a God? Answers about death. All the questions that your students had, um, they get answered in a personal way. And in some sense, you just begin to make peace with these questions. I mean, nobody really answers them, I don't think. I mean, probably maybe some people do, but they're hard. The human condition is such that these questions follow us throughout most of our lives, but you begin to make peace with them, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and the whole setup of the course, and trying to look at this, what's called like a design perspective, is actually starting with the problem. So, and then we look at like how do the different religions try to respond to the particular problem, and so that's exactly what the Buddha does. Starts. We have a problem.
Right.
We have a problem. We have this problem of suffering, and
Right.
and it seems like a lot of the world religions are responding to in different ways to that particular problem.
Yeah.
Christianity, there's like some sort of disordered connection between human beings and the divine. And so it's like a lot of different religions will respond differently. In Hinduism, it's like, how do I get back to the one? How do I get back to Brahman? So it's just fascinating. It's like you do have this, it's just different approaches to trying to solve these existential human problems.
Yeah.
That we constantly have.
Right.
So just like one more question, just to so we pay attention to your time. So one of the things that students also wrestle with is this notion of reincarnation, and they studied reincarnation in Hinduism, and with the idea, and especially knowing that Buddhism kind of comes out of the Hindu, or at least the Indian tradition, the Vedantic traditions. But in Hinduism, you do have a little bit of a nugget, or like a string of pearls theory. It's like you do have a little bit of a self, a little bit of a soul that kind of carries from one life to the next, and then you're constantly trying to break out of that cycle, and become one with Brahman. So how is Buddhism distinct from that? So if there's reincarnation, what is, I guess the question was like, if there's reincarnation, like what is it that's being reincarnated?
Yeah. So my teacher never talked about reincarnation. I don't think he ever mentioned the word once. I know it's big in the Tibetan tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I also know that the Dalai Lama has recently said, you know what, maybe I won't be reincarnated the next time around. I think the Tibetan tradition is probably moving away from that. I mean, this is just my 2 cents. It's completely irrelevant. Like people shouldn't even think about it. Essentially, there's nothing from like I think the pure Buddhist perspective, at least the Zen perspective. There's absolutely nothing that like gets reincarnated. No essential element of you that could possibly be reincarnated in some future life, because there's no separation right now fundamentally between you and the world around you. So, like I said, it's more like if you're looking at a wave, there's some particular moment, some particular ripple on a wave crashing on the shore, and the great big, huge, massive, cosmic, galactic chain of being that wave, you're one ripple on it. Where does that ripple go when where does that drop of water that comes off the waterfall go when it merges again with the waterfall? You know, it was briefly separate. It took shape, it took form, and then it emerged or reunited with the bigger picture. I think it's probably the same thing that happens. You know, if you want to look at reincarnation from kind of a Zen perspective, probably similar to that. I mean, when you burn a piece of wood, there's smoke and there's ashes and there's heat, right? So when a human being dies, perhaps it somehow takes a new form. Maybe consciousness that we had somehow takes a new form. But the idea that a lump of me gets passed on and becomes a new lump in a new life, that's not essential to any Zen teaching I ever learned. I think people should just throw it out. It's just too much religion, too much theory and doctrine, and it's confusing, you know.
Yeah. Well, it gets back to your point. It's like it's not the intellectual pursuit or the theological pursuit. You know, Zen is embracing the action and the activity. Yeah. But I think the analogy that you present, you know, is really apt. And so it's not as if it's thinking of, it's almost like even changing the name and not even really even calling it reincarnation, because the idea of reincarnation, it implies that something as an entity is born again, is reborn. Yeah. Where so essentially thinking of reincarnation in a more universalistic approach of like saying like you go out of being and something comes back, you know, it's like because you're such a temporary coming together of you know all of these things, it goes out of being, and then a bunch of things kind of like come back into being, you know, I guess not sort of out of being, but like, you know, so like are no longer the same form something else. And so it's not really thinking about like in reincarnation, it's more of a dissipating, I guess, and reforming. But yeah, it's not a you. It's not an I. It's not an individual. So right. Yeah, the characteristics kind of dissipate, and then they'll come back and come together in a different way.
Yeah, and the practice makes it, you know, theoretically makes you at peace with the world and the universe that gives rise to you, that gave birth to you, and you trust the process that will take you in some form out of this universe when you die, you know. Mm-hmm. So the question then becomes not what happens to me after I die, but making peace with the world you're in and the process that gave birth to you, so that it's not a problem what happens to you after you die, you know. And that, of course, that's a hard one. I mean, I was doing work with a different Zen master than my teacher, and he said, I'm afraid of death. He said, and I'm a Zen master, you know. So I mean, it's not easy. Yeah, we're all human, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I mean, we could spend hours and could spend the whole semester talking with you about this and these insights. So, but no, I'm sure I'll let you know, like you know, how the conversation in class goes. Good. Yeah. So thanks for me, and thanks for the class.
Thanks for letting me yak.